Hello and welcome back. Settle in wherever you are, a bed, a couch, a chair that's gone soft with use, and let the rest of tonight belong to you. Tonight, we're going back further than most history ever dares to go. Past the pyramids, past the first cities, past almost everything you were taught to think of as the beginning. We're traveling to the edge of the last ice age, to a world of retreating glaciers and rising seas where something strange happened. A warm world plunged suddenly back into cold. A hunting people built a temple before they had learned to farm, and an entire way of life simply stopped, leaving behind only fragments for us to piece together 10,000 years later in the dust. You don't need to remember any of it. That's not why we're here. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let your jaw unclench, your shoulders drop an inch further into whatever is holding you up. Breathe in slowly and let it out even slower. There is nothing to solve tonight, no test in the morning, only a long, quiet drift through deep time, one strange and gentle story at a time. So let the world outside go soft and far away. Let's begin. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists were certain they knew the oldest religious building on Earth. And then a shepherd in southeastern Turkey found something that broke that certainty apart. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to a low, unremarkable hill called Göbekli Tepe, a place local farmers had been plowing around for generations because their tools kept striking buried stone. What he found beneath that hill were rings of massive carved limestone pillars, some standing 16 feet tall, arranged with clear intention, built roughly 11,500 years ago. That is nearly 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 6,000 years before the pyramids. It was built, astonishingly, by people who had not yet invented farming. Sometimes the past keeps its grandest secrets for the humblest hills. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not blank stones. They are carved into the shapes of people, and it is a detail that quietly changes how you look at them. Many of the great T-shaped megaliths have arms etched faintly down their sides, hands curling forward at the base as if resting on an unseen belt. Some wear stone belts and loincloths carved in relief, small and specific, like a memory someone wanted preserved forever. They are not gods in any way we'd recognize, and not quite portraits either. They feel like presences, standing in careful circles, facing inward, watching whatever ceremonies once unfolded at their feet. 11,000 years of wind and silt could not erase the tenderness of those small carved hands wrapped around the human-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe is an entire menagerie of the ancient world, carved with startling skill into stone. Foxes slink along the pillar edges. Boars snarl mid-stride. Scorpions, cranes, and vultures appear again and again, and snakes coil in low relief across nearly every surface researchers have uncovered. Nothing here looks like art for art's sake. The animals seem to mean something, arranged with the same deliberate logic as constellations, though what story they were telling has been lost for 11,500 years. Whatever a scorpion or a circling vulture meant to the people who lived there, it mattered enough to carve in stone built to outlast them completely. One pillar at Göbekli Tepe has come to be called the vulture stone, and it may be the closest thing we have to a caption on this entire mysterious site. Carved into its face is a long-necked vulture with wings outstretched, seeming to lift something round and small above its shoulder, alongside scorpions, snakes, and a headless human figure below. Some researchers read it as a symbolic scene of what archaeologists call sky burial, where the dead were left exposed to be carried off, quite literally, by birds. Others believe it may even encode a memory of a catastrophic event. A comet told the only way a language without writing could tell it, in pictures carved to last forever. No one alive today can read it with certainty, and maybe that is exactly why it still holds our attention. Perhaps the strangest fact about Göbekli Tepe isn't what was built there. It's what was done to it afterward. At some point, deliberately and carefully, the people who used this site filled its stone chambers with rubble, soil, and debris, burying their own temple beneath the earth. This wasn't collapse or abandonment through neglect. The fill was packed in with intention, layer by layer, as though the structure were being put to rest rather than left to ruin. Archaeologists still debate why. Perhaps its purpose had been fulfilled. Perhaps it was closed the way you might close a chapter, gently, on purpose, so that something new could begin. Whatever the reason, that burial is precisely what preserved it, undisturbed, unlooted, waiting 11,000 years for a shepherd's plow to find it again. Before Göbekli Tepe, the story of civilization went in a tidy order. People settled down, farmed, and only then, once fed and secure, did they build temples and monuments to their gods. Göbekli Tepe quietly rearranges that order. The people who raised its pillars were still hunter-gatherers, following gazelle herds and gathering wild grains, with no permanent villages and no domesticated crops. And yet somehow they organized the labor of moving stones weighing as much as 10 tons, without wheels, without metal tools, without a written word to plan it. It suggests that perhaps it wasn't the invention of farming that led people to build together. Perhaps it was the need to build something sacred together that led, eventually, to farming. Just a short walk from Göbekli Tepe, on a nearby hillside called Kağıtrahan Tepe, archaeologists found something that makes the mystery even richer. Excavated more seriously only in recent years, the site contains its own forest of carved pillars, but also something Göbekli Tepe has not shown us. A chamber with dozens of human-headed phallic pillars jutting from stone benches, and a sculpture of a human face gazing up from a niche carved directly into bedrock. Kağıtrahan Tepe appears to be part of the same wide culture, the same builders, working across a landscape of hills rather than a single site. It's a reminder that Göbekli Tepe was never really alone. It was one voice in a much larger, much older conversation we are only just beginning to hear. Not far from Göbekli Tepe lies a site called Navyaçla Chori, which today rests underwater, submerged deliberately beneath a reservoir when a dam was built in the 1990. Before it disappeared beneath the water, archaeologists managed to document its own T-shaped pillars, carved with human arms and faces, along with one of the oldest known temple buildings with a smoothed lime plaster floor. It shared Göbekli Tepe's strange grammar of stone people standing in circles, built by the same broad culture in the same narrow slice of deep time. There is something quietly moving about a place surviving 11,000 years of empires and floods, only to be gently drowned on purpose in our own lifetime. For the sake of electricity, the people who built Göbekli Tepe left behind something almost as remarkable as the stones themselves, evidence of feasting on an enormous scale. Archaeologists have found massive limestone vessels capable of holding over 40 gallons, along with the bones of gazelle and wild cattle in numbers suggesting hundreds of people gathered, ate, and likely drank together at this site. Some researchers now believe the temple wasn't built to house a settled religion at all, but instead served as a gathering point, a place where scattered hunting bands from many miles around converged once a year, feasting, trading, marrying, and building before dispersing again into the hills. Perhaps what drew people together, even 11,000 years ago, was never so different from what draws us together now. Just south of Göbekli Tepe's hills lies a wild grass called einkorn wheat, and genetic studies have traced its domesticated descendants to this very region. The Karakadag Mountains, visible from the temple itself. This means the birthplace of one of humanity's first cultivated crops sits almost within eyesight of the world's oldest known monumental structure. It is tempting and increasingly plausible to imagine that farming didn't spread outward from a single practical discovery, but instead grew up around a place people already gathered for other reasons entirely, reasons of ceremony, memory, and belonging. The first bread, in other words, may have been baked in the shadow of the first temple, one human need quietly feeding another. Around 12,900 years ago, after millennia of steady post-Ice Age warming, the climate of the northern hemisphere did something almost unthinkable. It reversed within what may have been just a few decades, perhaps even less. Temperatures plunged back toward Ice Age conditions, undoing thousands of years of gradual thaw in what felt, geologically speaking, like the blink of an eye. Scientists call this abrupt cold Snap the Younger Dryas, named for a small Arctic wildflower whose pollen shows up suddenly in lake sediments from that layer. A delicate little flag marking a global shiver. Forests that had crept northward retreated. Glaciers that had been quietly dying suddenly found their strength again. It is a humbling thing to realize that the climate we depend on has, at least once before, changed its mind almost overnight. Deep in the ice of Greenland, scientists have drilled cores that read like tree rings made of frozen time, each layer a snapshot of a single year's snowfall stretching back tens of thousands of years. Within those cores, right at the start of the Younger Dryas, lies a layer that still puzzles researchers. A spike of unusual material, including tiny diamonds far too small to see without a microscope, along with elevated platinum and other markers rarely found together in nature. Some scientists interpret this layer as evidence of a comet or fragmented asteroid striking or exploding above the ice sheets of North America, an event violent enough to scatter debris across an entire hemisphere. Others remain unconvinced, arguing the evidence has more mundane explanations. Either way, the ice remembers something from that moment, even if we're still learning how to read it. The idea has come to be called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it proposes something dramatic: that a comet, likely fragmented into multiple pieces, either struck or detonated above the great ice sheets covering North America roughly 12,900 years ago. Proponents point to a scattered layer of unusual materials found at dozens of sites across 3 continents, all dating to the same narrow moment, as evidence of sudden, widespread devastation. Critics, and there are many respected ones, argue the dating is inconsistent and the materials could form through ordinary processes, no comet required. It remains one of the most contested ideas in modern archaeology, neither proven nor disproven, a genuine live mystery rather than a settled fact. Sometimes the most honest thing science can offer is a question still being asked in good faith. Across the eastern United States, geologists have long puzzled over a curious dark layer of soil, nicknamed the black mat, found buried at sites from Arizona to Pennsylvania. This thin band of dark, organic-rich sediment sits right at the boundary marking the start of the Younger Dryas cooling, and directly beneath it, and never above it, lie the bones and tools of the Ice Age megafauna and the human hunters who once tracked them. Above the black mat, that world is simply gone, whatever caused this dark layer to form. And its cause is still debated. It marks one of the cleanest, strangest boundaries in the North American fossil record. A single dark line across a continent, separating one world from the one that followed, scattered across the coastal plain from Maryland to Georgia, are more than 500,000 shallow, oval-shaped depressions in the earth, oddly uniform, oddly aligned, known as the Carolina Bays. Seen from above, they look almost deliberate, all oriented in roughly the same northwest to southeast direction, like the impact scars of something falling in formation from the sky. For decades, the leading explanation involved wind and water shaping ancient lake basins over long stretches of time, and many geologists still favor exactly that. But a smaller group of researchers has proposed something more startling: that these bays are the scars of icy comet fragments raining down at the very start of the Younger Dryas. No crater material conclusively proving impact has ever been found beneath them. The land holds its shape and keeps its secret. When the Younger Dryas cold arrived, it didn't just chill the air. It appears to have coincided with the disappearance of dozens of large mammal species that had thrived through the Ice Age for tens of thousands of years. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths the size of a small elephant, and saber-toothed cats vanish from the fossil record within this same narrow window across North America. Scientists still debate how much of this was driven by the abrupt climate shift, how much by human hunters spreading across a continent for the first time, and how much by some combination, the two intertwined. What's certain is the timing. An entire cast of Ice Age giants, creatures that had outlasted glaciers and warm spells alike for millennia, closes out within just a few thousand years of that one strange cold snap. Long before Egypt's pyramids, before Britain's Stonehenge, a very different set of hunters was leaving its mark across the plains of North America. A beautifully crafted stone spear point we now call the Clovis point, fluted at the base so it could be lashed tightly to a wooden shaft. First identified near Clovis, New Mexico, these elegant, leaf-shaped blades turn up at hundreds of sites across the continent, a signature so widespread and so consistent that archaeologists once believed the Clovis people were the very first humans to reach the Americas. For decades, their toolkit represented the beginning of the whole story. A single elegant design, chipped by hand from stone, tells us these were not simple people improvising by accident. They were skilled, deliberate, and remarkably widespread. Then, just as abruptly as it appears in the archaeological record, the distinctive Clovis toolkit disappears. And its disappearance lines up almost exactly with the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling. For roughly 400 years, hunters across North America had crafted this same recognizable fluted point. Then, within what looks like a remarkably short span, it simply stops being made. What replaced it were smaller, more regionally varied tool traditions, suggesting communities fragmenting, adapting, perhaps struggling, as their world grew suddenly colder and their prey grew scarcer. Whether this reflects a population collapse, a cultural shift, or simply changing hunting strategies remains genuinely unresolved. A tradition that had unified a continent's hunters for 4 centuries folded quietly into silence, right at the edge of the cold. For most of the 20th century, the story of how humans first reached the Americas was taught as settled fact. The Clovis people, walking across a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, once the ice sheets parted, were the first. Then, in the forests of southern Chile, at a site called Monte Verde, archaeologists uncovered something that didn't fit the timeline at all. Hearths, tent stakes, even a child's footprint preserved in ancient mud dating to well over 1,000 years before Clovis technology existed anywhere in North America. If people were already living at the southern tip of South America that early, they must have arrived in the Americas far earlier still, and likely by a different route altogether. One small footprint in Chilean mud quietly rewrote an entire hemisphere's origin story. In 2021, researchers studying the gypsum flats of White Sands, New Mexico, announced a discovery that pushed the human story in the Americas back even further than Monte Verde had suggested. A trackway of ancient human footprints preserved in the mud of a long-vanished lakeshore, dated to over 21,000 years ago. That places people walking this landscape not just before Clovis, but before the peak of the last ice age itself, when vast ice sheets should have made a Siberian crossing nearly impossible. The prints suggest mostly younger people and children walking back and forth along the lake edge, perhaps gathering food or simply playing, their pace and stride preserved by pure geological chance. 21,000 years later, something as fleeting as a child's footstep turned out to outlast empires. For decades, the question of how the first Americans traveled south from Alaska assumed a single, narrow route, a corridor of ice-free land opening up between two massive retreating ice sheets. But newer research suggests that corridor may not have been usable, biologically barren, or even open. At the time, the earliest evidence of humans in the Americas requires. Instead, many archaeologists now favor a coastal migration, following a shoreline route by boat or on foot along the Pacific edge, harvesting kelp forests and marine life the whole way south. It's a quieter, less dramatic story than an epic march across a frozen bridge, small groups hugging a coastline for generations, a slow tide of people rather than a single crossing. Long before the ice sheets fully retreated, an ancient landmass called Barangia connected what is now Siberia to Alaska, not as a narrow bridge, but as a vast, rolling plain hundreds of miles wide, thick with grasses and roaming megafauna. Genetic evidence from both modern and ancient populations suggests that people may have lived on this land for thousands of years before ever moving further into the Americas, effectively paused there in a kind of long genetic layover as glaciers blocked the route south. Researchers call this idea the Beringian standstill. Somewhere beneath the cold waters of the Bering Strait today lies a homeland that an entire generation once called permanent, now submerged beneath the sea that eventually closed the door behind them. As the world's ice sheets melted at the end of the last ice age, the water they released didn't just fill the oceans gradually. Evidence suggests it arrived in sudden, dramatic pulses. Geologists have identified what they call meltwater pulse 1A, a period roughly 14,700 years ago when global sea levels appear to have risen by as much as 50 feet in just a few centuries. Astonishingly fast by geological standards. Entire coastlines that generations of people had called home would have been swallowed within a few human lifetimes, forcing repeated migrations inland. It's a strange thing to consider. Somewhere beneath the waves today, the actual physical ground your very distant ancestors once stood on is still down there, quietly dissolving into silt. Between Britain and mainland Europe today lies the shallow, cold expanse of the North Sea. But 8,000 years ago, that seabed was dry land, a rolling country of rivers, marshes, and forests that archaeologists now call Doggerland. Fishing trawlers working those waters have, for generations, pulled up mammoth tusks, ancient antlers, and worked flint tools in their nets, dredged up from a landscape now buried under 60 feet of seawater. It was, by some estimates, one of the richest hunting grounds in Ice Age Europe, home to thousands of people before rising seas and a catastrophic tsunami finally drowned it for good. Somewhere down there, entire villages still wait in the dark and cold, exactly where the last person to see them dry ever left them. The final blow to Doggerland arrived suddenly, around 8,200 years ago, in the form of an underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, so large it's still studied today, the Storegga Slide. A section of seafloor, roughly the size of Iceland, collapsed and slid, displacing an immense volume of water and sending a tsunami racing across the North Sea toward the low, marshy remnants of Doggerland. Geological deposits of sand, swept far inland at sites in Scotland and Norway, still mark exactly how high and how far those waves reached. For whatever communities remained on that shrinking land, it would have arrived not as a slow erosion, but as a single overwhelming day, the sea finally taking, all at once, what it had spent millennia patiently reaching for. Human memory has a strange durability when it comes to catastrophe, and nowhere is that clearer than in the sheer number of ancient cultures, separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of miles, that each preserved a story about a great flood that once drowned the world. From Mesopotamia's tale of Utnapishtim to the biblical story of Noah, from flood myths recorded among indigenous peoples of the Americas to legends across Aboriginal Australia and Southeast Asia, the pattern repeats with uncanny consistency. Some researchers suspect these stories are echoes, however distorted by thousands of years of retelling, of the very real, very dramatic sea level rise that followed the last ice age. A story told carefully enough, it turns out, can survive the very flood it describes. Beneath the Black Sea, geologists have found a fascinating and contested layer of evidence for what's now called the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. The idea that around 600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural barrier at what is now the Bosphorus, pouring catastrophically into what had been a much smaller freshwater lake. Sediment cores show a sudden shift from freshwater to saltwater species, and some researchers have proposed the flooding was ferociously fast, submerging vast stretches of fertile lakeshore within months rather than centuries. A few have gone so far as to link this event to the deep cultural memory behind Mesopotamian and biblical flood stories. Other geologists argue the change was more gradual. Either way, an entire coastline of early farming villages now rests quietly on the Black Sea floor. Far to the southeast, an entire ancient world lies submerged beneath the shallow waters between modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, a landmass geologists call Sundaland. During the depths of the last ice age, when so much of the planet's water was locked into glaciers, sea levels sat over 300 feet lower than today, exposing an area of tropical lowland larger than India. Rivers ran across what is now open ocean. Forests grew where fishing boats now drift above open water. As the ice melted and the seas rose, this vast landmass shrank gradually into the scattered island chains we recognize today. A slow-motion flooding stretched across thousands of years rather than a single dramatic day. An entire tropical world swallowed not by catastrophe, but by simple patience. On the edge of the Egyptian Sahara, in a place so remote and dry, it seems an unlikely site for any ancient monument, lies a stone circle called Napta Playa, arranged by cattle herding peoples roughly 7,000 years ago, making it older than England's Stonehenge by a significant margin. Some of its upright stones appear aligned with the position of the sun on the summer solstice, suggesting these early herders were tracking the arrival of seasonal rains with careful, repeated observation of the sky in a landscape this unforgiving. Knowing exactly when the rains would come wasn't idle curiosity. It was survival itself, written into stone. Long before anyone called it astronomy, someone here was already patiently reading the sky for answers. In the caves of Chauvet in southern France, painted deep in chambers that sunlight has never naturally touched, are images of lions, horses, and rhinoceroses rendered with a confidence and subtlety that startled the archaeologists who first found them in 1994. Radiocarbon dating placed these paintings at over 30,000 years old, thousands of years older than the famous cave art at Lascaux, painted by people who lived through Ice Age winters we can barely imagine today. The animals appear to move, shaded and layered with a technique that looks almost like an understanding of motion itself, as if the artists had studied the exact moment a horse turns its head. Whatever these painters were trying to preserve, in the deep dark and the cold, it worked far longer than they could have known. Beneath the frozen soil of Siberia, the permafrost has been quietly performing a kind of accidental preservation for tens of thousands of years, occasionally releasing its secrets as the ground thaws at its edges. Whole woolly mammoth carcasses have emerged from that ice, with skin, hair, and even stomach contents still intact, their final meals of grass and wildflowers frozen exactly as they were swallowed. One famous mammoth, nicknamed Luba, was found so perfectly preserved that scientists could examine the milk still curdled in her tiny stomach. Today, a legal ivory trade has grown up around these ancient tusks, carved and sold as mammoth ivory, a strange modern echo of Ice Age life quietly re-entering circulation. Tusk by tusk, 10,000 years after the animal that grew them last breathed. One of the strangest scientific debates about the end of the Ice Age doesn't concern comets or climate at all, but a single massive lake that no longer exists, Glacial Lake Agassiz, once larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined, held back by a wall of ice across what is now Canada. Some researchers propose that when this ice dam finally gave way, An immense pulse of cold fresh water surged into the North Atlantic Ocean, disrupting the ocean currents that carry warmth northward from the tropics. If true, this single flood, rather than any comet, may be what actually triggered the abrupt cooling of the younger Dryas. The debate remains unresolved, but it's a striking thought. An entire hemisphere's climate, quietly hinging on the failure of one ice wall, one afternoon, in one remote corner of a vanished world, in the marshy lowlands of what is now Louisiana. Over 3,000 years before the pyramids, hunter-gatherers who had not yet adopted farming built something extraordinary. A complex of earthen mounds and ridges known today as Poverty Point, arranged in concentric half circles nearly 3/4 of a mile across. Moving the earth to build it would have required transporting an estimated 3/4 of a million cubic yards of soil, basket by basket, without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools. Like Göbekli Tepe half a world away, it stands as another quiet reminder that people without farms or writing were still fully capable of extraordinary collective ambition. Sometimes the desire to build something lasting arrives long before the tools we assume it requires. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, archaeologists have uncovered evidence at a site called Cuck Swamp of deliberate plant cultivation dating back nearly 10,000 years. Among the earliest independent origins of agriculture found anywhere on Earth. What makes it remarkable is that it developed in near total isolation from the wheat fields of the Fertile Crescent or the rice paddies of China. A separate human population arriving on its own at the same fundamental idea. Early farmers here drained wetland soil using networks of small ditches, coaxing bananas and taro into cultivation in a landscape most outsiders would never think to farm at all. It's a gentle reminder that necessity, wherever it finds people, tends to whisper the same quiet solutions. Long before Britain's famous stone circle reached its final form, the site of Stonehenge had already been in use for centuries, beginning as a simple circular ditch and bank enclosure around 5,000 years ago, well before a single one of its massive sarsen stones was ever raised. Archaeologists have found cremated human remains within this earlier phase, suggesting the site functioned first and foremost as a burial ground, a place for the dead long before it became a monument aligned with any solstice. The stones we picture so vividly today were a later addition layered onto a landscape that already carried centuries of quiet ceremony and memory. Even our most iconic monuments, it turns out, were rarely built in a single afternoon of inspiration. They accumulated meaning slowly, the way a path deepens only through years of the same feet walking it. At the ancient site of Jericho in the Jordan Valley, archaeologists uncovered something remarkable buried beneath the floors of Neolithic homes. Human skulls, carefully removed after death, modeled over with plaster to recreate facial features, and in some cases fitted with shells set into the eye sockets. This practice, now called the Jericho skull cult, dates back roughly 9,000 years and appears to reflect a culture deeply invested in keeping its ancestors present among the living, quite literally under their own floors. Rather than fearing the dead, these communities seem to have kept them close, their faces reconstructed and remembered rather than left behind. It suggests that the impulse to hold on to those we've lost, to keep their faces near us somehow, is far older than any religion we can name. Also at Jericho, archaeologists uncovered something else that reshaped the story of the earliest cities. A massive stone wall, more than 10 feet tall, paired with an equally massive circular stone tower, both built around 11,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known fortified settlements on Earth. For years, scholars assumed the wall must have been built for defense against human enemies, but more recent research has floated another possibility, that it protected the settlement from flooding or mudslides sweeping down from nearby hills, a defense against nature rather than against other people. Either explanation tells the same quiet human truth, that almost as soon as people began settling in one place, they began building walls to protect what they had chosen to keep. In central Turkey, a few thousand years after Göbekli Tepe was carefully buried, an entirely different kind of settlement rose from the plain, Çatalhöyük, a densely packed town of mud brick homes built so close together that residents entered not through doors, but through holes in their roofs, walking across rooftops to reach their own front steps. Inside, walls were plastered and repainted again and again, sometimes decorated with the horns of wild cattle set directly into the walls like household shrines. There were no streets in the way we'd recognize them, no clear center or plan, just house after house, life stacked against life for nearly 2,000 years. It stands as one of the earliest glimpses of what happens when people choose, again and again, to live in close and constant company with each other. Among the more curious objects recovered from Çatalhöyük are small polished discs of obsidian, a volcanic glass, worked and buffed until their surfaces became reflective enough to function as some of the earliest mirrors ever made. Long before bronze or silvered glass, someone sat in a mud brick room 9,000 years ago and looked back at their own dark, wavering reflection, likely for the very first time in the way we'd understand it today. Obsidian itself had to be traded in from volcanic sources many miles away, meaning these mirrors carried not just an image, but the memory of distant journeys, of trade routes crossing hills and rivers just to bring a person their own face. Vanity, it turns out, is one of the oldest luxuries humans have ever gone out of their way to acquire. On the coast of South Africa, in a cave overlooking the Indian Ocean called Blombos, archaeologists found a small piece of ochre stone engraved with a deliberate cross-hatched pattern, scratched by hand roughly 73,000 years ago. It is one of the oldest known examples of abstract, deliberate mark-making by human hands anywhere on Earth, long before cave paintings, long before farming, long before almost anything we associate with the beginnings of culture. Alongside it, archaeologists found shell beads pierced and strung, and a kind of ancient ochre processing workshop, complete with tools for grinding pigment. Someone, tens of thousands of years before writing existed, sat in that cave and simply wanted to make a pattern, for reasons we will never fully recover. And somehow that small want survived 73,000 years of tide and dust. Deep in the mountains of southern Siberia, a small, unassuming cave called Denisova has quietly rewritten what we know about human history entirely through the DNA of a single tiny finger bone. Genetic analysis revealed it belonged to neither a modern human nor a Neanderthal, but an entirely distinct group now known as the Denisovans, a population known almost exclusively through their genes, rather than any recognizable skeleton or face. Traces of Denisovan DNA still show up today in modern populations across Asia and Oceania, particularly among Tibetans whose Denisovan ancestry appears to have helped them adapt to life at extreme high altitude. An entire branch of humanity, known to us mostly by a fingertip, quietly lives on today in the lungs of people breathing thin mountain air on the other side of the world for a long stretch of the last ice age. At least 3 different kinds of humans appear to have shared the planet at the same time. Our own species, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, and Denisovans further east, with smaller, more mysterious populations like the diminutive Homo floresiensis surviving on isolated Indonesian islands. Genetic evidence shows these groups didn't just coexist at a distance. They interbred repeatedly and across vast stretches of geography, leaving fragments of each other's DNA scattered through populations alive today. It's a strange thing to sit with, that for most of human history, being human wasn't a single, solitary story, but a crowded one. Several different kinds of us, walking the same ice age earth, sometimes as strangers and sometimes as family. On the remote Indonesian island of Flores, in a cave called Liang Bua, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a hominin species so small it earned an immediate nickname, the Hobbit. Standing barely over 3 feet tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, Homo floresiensis nonetheless made stone tools and apparently hunted the small, isolated elephants that once roamed the island until as recently as 50,000 years ago. Scientists still debate exactly how a species so small and small-brained managed such sophisticated survival, with some proposing they descended from an earlier, more primitive human ancestor isolated on the island for hundreds of thousands of years. An entire hidden branch of the human family tree, it seems, lived out its whole existence on one small island, waiting quietly to be found. Somewhere in southern Africa, sometime between 100 and 200,000 years ago, lived the woman geneticists refer to as mitochondrial Eve, not the only woman alive at that time, and not a solitary first human in any biblical sense, but the most recent common ancestor from whom every person alive today inherited their mitochondrial DNA, the small genetic material passed only from mother to child. Somewhere else, and at a different time, lived the man researchers call Y chromosome Adam, the most recent common ancestor of every man's Y chromosome alive today. They never met, never knew each other existed, separated potentially by tens of thousands of years. And yet, mathematically, quietly, every person breathing right now can trace an unbroken maternal thread back to her, and every man an unbroken paternal thread back to him in eastern Washington state, along the banks of the Columbia River, Workers in 1996 stumbled upon a set of ancient human bones that would spark one of the most contentious legal and scientific disputes in American archaeology. The remains known as Kennewick Man, dated to roughly 9,000 years old. For years, the skeleton became the subject of a prolonged legal battle between scientists wanting to study it and local Native American tribes who considered the remains an ancestor deserving immediate reburial. Eventually, in 2015, genetic testing settled the scientific question decisively, confirming close ancestry to modern indigenous peoples of the region, and the remains were returned and buried according to tribal tradition in 2017. It took 21 years and the patient work of DNA to finally let one ancient man rest. In 1968, on a ranch in Montana, construction workers uncovered the burial of an infant boy, laid to rest with more than 100 exquisitely crafted stone and antler tools, dating back nearly 13,000 years. Known today as the Anzac Child, his remains represent the oldest human genome ever sequenced from the Americas, and the genetic results were striking. His ancestry traces directly to populations still living across the Americas today, offering some of the clearest evidence yet that a single ancient population arriving from Asia gave rise to the vast diversity of indigenous peoples across two whole continents. A child buried with such evident care nearly 13,000 years ago ended up quietly answering questions his own people could never have imagined anyone would ask. A more contested idea in the story of the first Americans is known as the Soelo-Otrean hypothesis, which proposes that some of the earliest people to reach the Americas may have come not from Siberia at all, but from Ice Age Europe, traveling by boat along the edge of the frozen North Atlantic pack ice. Proponents point to certain similarities between European Soelo-Otrean stone tools and later Clovis points as possible evidence of contact. The overwhelming majority of archaeologists and geneticists reject this idea, noting that genetic evidence points overwhelmingly toward Asian ancestry for indigenous American populations, with no genetic signature of ancient European arrival. It remains a fringe idea within the field, worth knowing mainly as an example of how tempting and how often mistaken a good story can be. In southern Oregon, a set of unassuming caves called the Paisley Caves gave archaeologists something almost too humble to imagine holding historical importance: fossilized human waste, technically called coprolites, dated through DNA analysis to over 14,000 years old. Unglamorous as the discovery may sound, it provided some of the earliest direct genetic evidence of human presence in North America, predating Clovis technology by well over 1,000 years. Alongside the human DNA, researchers found traces of the plants and animals these ancient people had eaten, offering a strangely intimate glimpse of an actual meal, digested and preserved by pure chance in a dry cave floor. Sometimes the most ordinary leftovers of a life turn out to be exactly what history needed to remember it by. Across the plains of Ice Age North America roamed a predator whose name still carries an eerie familiarity today: the dire wolf, larger and more powerfully built than any wolf alive now, built for taking down prey the size of bison and young mammoths. Thousands of their bones have been recovered from the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, trapped over millennia after being lured in by other struggling animals, only to become stuck themselves in the same sticky asphalt. Genetic studies published in recent years revealed dire wolves were far more distantly related to modern gray wolves than anyone expected, an entirely separate lineage that simply resembled wolves through convergent evolution. They vanished, along with so much of the Ice Age world, roughly 10,000 years ago, leaving only their bones sunk deep in California tar to tell us they were ever here at all. The La Brea tar pits, sitting improbably in the middle of modern Los Angeles, preserve one of the richest windows into Ice Age California anywhere on Earth, formed by natural asphalt seeping up through the ground over tens of thousands of years. Animals would wander onto pools disguised by dust or shallow water, become trapped by the thick, clinging tar, and their cries would draw in predators hoping for an easy meal, who then became trapped themselves in the very same spot. This grim cycle repeated so often that the pits preserve an extraordinary concentration of predators: dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and American lions, far more than would occur naturally, a kind of accidental, ancient predator trap. It's a strange, sobering thought that a hunting ground meant to feed the desperate instead became a tar-black museum, patiently waiting 11,000 years for us to open it. Among the strangest predators lost at the end of the Ice Age was the American lion, larger even than modern African lions, whose fossils have turned up not just in tar pits, but across a range stretching from Alaska to Peru. Cave paintings in Europe of similar Ice Age lions depict them without the thick manes familiar from Africa today, suggesting these northern cats looked subtly different from their modern relatives. Despite the shared name, they would have hunted alongside dire wolves and saber-toothed cats in a landscape almost unrecognizably dangerous compared to the same regions today. A world where nearly every large animal had sharper teeth and heavier claws than anything currently walking there. It is strange to imagine lions prowling the frozen edges of Alaska, and stranger still that they are simply gone now and have been for 10,000 years. The Irish elk, despite its name, ranged across most of Ice Age Europe and Asia, and carried perhaps the most extraordinary antlers any deer species has ever grown, spanning up to 12 feet across, a genuinely staggering weight to carry balanced on a single skull. For years, scientists debated whether these enormous antlers were a kind of evolutionary trap, a sexually selected ornament that grew so large it eventually contributed to the species' extinction. More recent research suggests the antlers themselves weren't the true culprit, and that changing habitats and human hunting pressure played the larger role as the Ice Age closed. Either way, there's something quietly moving about an animal that carried, quite literally on its own head, a monument to its own extravagant, doomed beauty. Among the more unusual Ice Age survivors of North America was the giant beaver, growing to the size of a modern black bear with teeth up to 6 inches long, an animal that would have reshaped its wetland habitat far more dramatically than its small modern cousin ever could. Fossils suggest these giant beavers likely lacked the flat, paddle-shaped tail and complex dam-building instincts of today's beavers, behaving more like slow, lumbering wetland grazers than skilled engineers. They disappeared along with the rest of the Ice Age megafauna roughly 10,000 years ago, leaving modern beavers barely a fraction of their size to quietly inherit the wetlands their giant relatives once dominated. Sometimes, what survives an extinction isn't the strongest version of a creature, but simply the smaller, humbler one that needed less to get by. Few Ice Age animals capture the imagination quite like the saber-toothed cat, whose curved upper canines could grow to 7 inches long, extending well past the jaw even when the mouth was closed. Contrary to old imaginings of a fearsome roar, studies of its skull and jaw musculature suggest it likely killed with a controlled, precise bite to the throat or belly of already subdued prey, rather than through brute crushing force. Thousands of individuals have been recovered from the La Brea tar pits, allowing scientists to study healed injuries on their bones, evidence that these cats sometimes survived brutal wounds, cared for, or simply resilient enough to recover on their own. Even the most fearsome predator the Ice Age produced, it turns out, still carried its wounds like any of us, old, healed, and quietly written into the bone. High in the mountains of Lebanon lies the ancient site of Baalbek, home to some of the largest cut stone blocks ever incorporated into a human structure. 3 colossal limestone megaliths known as the Trilithon, each weighing an estimated 800 tons, set into a Roman-era temple platform. What makes them so remarkable isn't just their size, but the mystery of how they were moved at all, using only wooden rollers, ropes, and enormous human effort from a quarry located a short distance away. A fourth, even larger block, nicknamed the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, was abandoned still in that quarry, weighing well over 1,000 tons, apparently too heavy even for its ambitious builders to finish moving. It sits there still today, a monument not to what people accomplished, but to the exact moment their ambition finally met its limit. On the small Mediterranean island of Malta, a cluster of megalithic temples predates both Stonehenge and the pyramids of Egypt by well over 1,000 years, making them, by some measures, the oldest known freestanding stone structures on the planet. Built from massive limestone blocks between roughly 3,600 and 2,500 BCE, temples like Gigantea feature curved, rounded chambers rather than straight walls, giving them an oddly organic, almost womb-like architecture, unlike anything built elsewhere at the time. Beneath the island, a separate underground complex called the Hypogeum was carved directly into bedrock, chamber after chamber descending in careful darkness, eventually holding the remains of thousands of individuals. On an island barely larger than a small city, an entire distinctive civilization quietly built its whole world in curves off the southern coast of Japan's Yonagi-Oni Island. Divers exploring the seafloor in 1986 discovered a striking rock formation, roughly 100 feet long, marked with sharp-edged terraces, flat platforms, and what almost look like carved steps, sitting some 70 feet below the surface. Some researchers have proposed it as the remains of a sunken, humanly built structure, evidence of a lost civilization drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. The mainstream geological view, held by most experts who have studied it, is that the formation results from the natural fracturing of the local sandstone, which tends to break along strikingly straight, angular lines entirely without human help. Even stone, left alone in the dark for long enough, can start to look like it remembers being built. At a site called Tal El Hammam in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a sudden, catastrophic destruction event around 1650 BCE, marked by melted pottery, scorched human remains, and mineral traces consistent with extreme, brief, high-temperature heat. A team of researchers proposed in 2021 that the destruction resulted from an airburst, a small asteroid or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere above the city, similar in scale to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, releasing devastating heat and force without ever forming an impact crater. The idea generated significant excitement and significant skepticism, with some researchers questioning aspects of the interpretation and dating. Whatever leveled that ancient city so suddenly and so completely, it left behind exactly the kind of ambiguous, tantalizing evidence that keeps careful scientists arguing for decades. Beneath the ice of Antarctica, sealed away from sunlight and open air for what may be millions of years, lies Lake Vostok, one of the largest subglacial lakes ever discovered, hidden more than 2 miles beneath the surface. Russian researchers drilled down to its edge over decades of painstaking work, careful not to contaminate an environment that had been completely isolated from the rest of the planet for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Scientists have found evidence of microbial life adapted to this extreme, lightless world, organisms that have essentially been living in total isolation since long before the first ice age megafauna ever walked. It is strange to think that our planet still keeps entire hidden worlds sealed shut and waiting directly beneath the ice we've walked across for generations. Along the eastern coast of Papua New Guinea, ancient coral reefs on the Huon Peninsula have been pushed upward over thousands of years by the slow grinding of tectonic plates, creating a rare and precious record, a staircase of fossilized reef terraces each one marking a past sea level, stacked like rings in a tree. By carefully dating each terrace, scientists have reconstructed a remarkably precise record of how global sea levels rose and fell across the end of the last ice age, confirming the dramatic, sudden pulses of meltwater flooding earlier researchers had only theorized about elsewhere. It's an elegant kind of evidence, patient and quiet. A coral reef simply doing what corals do for thousands of years, and in the process, keeping an accidental diary of the entire vanishing ice age world. In caves around the world, mineral formations called speleothems, the stalactites and stalagmites that build up slowly from dripping water, have become one of climate science's most trusted witnesses to the deep past. Each thin layer of mineral, deposited drop by drop over centuries, carries a chemical signature reflecting the temperature and rainfall of the moment it formed, allowing scientists to reconstruct ancient climates with startling precision. Cave records from China, Europe, and Brazil, all independently, show the same abrupt cooling signature at the start of the Younger Dryas, confirming it wasn't a localized event, but something that reshaped weather patterns across the globe almost simultaneously. It's a strange comfort, somehow, that the quietest, slowest growing things in the world, stone built one patient drip at a time, turned out to be some of the most honest narrators we have. On the rocky hillsides of Gobustan in modern Azerbaijan, more than 6,000 ancient rock carvings stretch across a landscape of stone, depicting hunting scenes, dancing figures, and boats crowded with rowers, some dated back over 10,000 years. The boats are especially striking, since Gobustan today sits nowhere near open water suitable for such vessels, suggesting either a very different ancient coastline or long-distance cultural memory of seafaring peoples passing through. Similar reed boat imagery appears in rock art scattered across other ancient sites, hinting at forgotten maritime traditions we know almost nothing else about. A stretch of dry hillside, carved patiently over thousands of years, may be the closest thing we have to a logbook of journeys no written record ever thought to save. In the caves of Altamira in northern Spain, painted ceilings depict bison rendered with such anatomical precision and shading that when the site was first properly investigated in the 1880, many scholars refused to believe the paintings were genuinely ancient at all, assuming no prehistoric people could have created something so skilled. It would take decades and the discovery of similarly sophisticated art elsewhere before the scientific community fully accepted what a local landowner's young daughter had first spotted looking upward while exploring the cave as a child. The bison seemed to shift and breathe in flickering torchlight, their forms following the cave's own natural curves and bulges in the rock, using the stone itself as part of the composition. Sometimes it takes the honesty of a child looking up, rather than an expert looking for what they expect, to actually see what's been there all along. Among the earliest known permanent settlements anywhere on Earth were built by a people archaeologists call the Natio-Ophians, who lived across the Levant roughly 15,000 years ago, harvesting wild wheat and barley long before anyone had thought to plant a single seed on purpose. They built round stone houses, ground wild grain with stone tools, and buried their dead with ornaments made of shell and bone, all while remaining technically hunter-gatherers rather than farmers. Their settlements represent one of the crucial missing links between a wandering way of life and the settled world that would eventually follow. Proof that people chose to stay in one place before they had any technical need to. Sometimes a home comes first, and only afterward do people figure out how to feed it. At a site called Shubiwaika 1 in the black basalt desert of northeastern Jordan, archaeologists uncovered charred crumbs in an ancient fireplace that turned out to be the oldest known bread in the world, baked by hunter-gatherers more than 14,000 years ago, thousands of years before farming existed anywhere. Made from wild wheat, barley, and the ground roots of a wetland plant called clubrush. This flatbread was painstakingly prepared by people with no crops of their own, gathering and grinding wild grain by hand for what must have been a considerable effort for a single meal. It suggests bread wasn't a convenient byproduct of farming at all, but something people wanted badly enough to invent long before farming existed to make it easier. Some appetites, it turns out, are old enough to have invented agriculture just to satisfy themselves. Not far from Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists studying the giant stone vats found at the site noticed a curious residue along their interior walls, consistent with the byproducts of fermentation. It has led some researchers to propose, with appropriate caution, that the massive gatherings believed to have taken place here may have included something like an early beer, brewed from wild grains as part of the feasting that accompanied construction and ceremony. The idea remains debated rather than settled, but it adds a strangely relatable layer to an already remarkable sight. People gathering from many miles around, raising heavy stones by day, and perhaps sharing something resembling a drink together by night. Even 11,000 years ago, it seems, hard work and good company may have called for something to toast with. One of the more debated claims about Göbekli Tepe involves a single carved pillar, sometimes called Pillar 43, marked with a series of V-shaped symbols arranged around its animal carvings in a pattern some researchers have proposed represents a kind of ancient calendar, possibly even recording the very comet event some believe triggered the Younger Dryas cooling. If accurate, it would make it the oldest known astronomical record in human history, carved in stone millennia before writing existed anywhere. Many archaeologists remain skeptical of this specific interpretation, noting how easily meaningful patterns can be found in decorative carving after the fact. It's a fitting kind of mystery for a site that seems built quite deliberately to keep asking more questions than it ever intends to answer. In a cave in Germany called Bonn Bergkassel, archaeologists uncovered the grave of a young man and woman buried together roughly 14,000 years ago alongside the remains of a young dog. One of the earliest confirmed examples of a domesticated dog buried deliberately alongside humans. Analysis of the dog's teeth revealed it had suffered from a serious illness as a puppy, one that would have required weeks of intensive care to survive. Evidence that these Ice Age people nursed a sick animal back to health for no practical gain at all. It suggests the bond between humans and dogs wasn't purely transactional from the very start. It included something closer to simple, patient affection. Even 14,000 years ago, it seems, someone stayed up nursing a sick puppy simply because they loved it. Carved from mammoth ivory roughly 40,000 years ago, a small statuette found in Germany's Hohle Fels cave depicts a female figure with exaggerated hips and breasts, one of the oldest known examples of figurative art anywhere on Earth. It belongs to a wider family of so-called Venus figurines found scattered across Ice Age Europe, from the famous Venus of Willendorf in Austria to smaller carvings found from France to Russia, each shaped by different hands in different eras, but sharing the same essential form. No one knows for certain what they meant fertility symbols, spiritual figures, or something else entirely lost to time. But their sheer geographic spread suggests a shared visual language stretching across an enormous swath of the Ice Age world. Whatever these small carved women represented, someone thought the idea worth carrying across an entire continent. There's something fitting about pausing here, halfway through a journey this long, to say a small and simple thing. If this kind of slow wandering through the deep past is the sort of thing that helps you drift off, a like or a quiet comment somewhere below helps this little channel find its way to other tired minds out there. Nothing urgent, nothing to think about now, just something to remember whenever you happen to be awake enough to. For now, let's keep going, further back, further down, into the quiet dark of everything that came before. Long before farming reached Europe, hunter-gatherers across Ice Age Russia and Ukraine faced a landscape almost entirely without trees, and they adapted by building homes from what the land actually offered: the bones of woolly mammoths. At sites like Mezhirich in Ukraine, archaeologists have found the remains of dome-shaped huts constructed from dozens of mammoth skulls, jawbones, and tusks stacked and arranged with real architectural skill, likely once covered with hides for insulation. Building even one such structure would have required the bones of multiple enormous animals, whether hunted directly or scavenged from carcasses found on the open steppe. It's a striking image, an entire household, warm and sheltered through the brutal cold of an Ice Age winter, built from the patient, careful reassembly of something that had once been alive and enormous along the banks of a Siberian river near the Arctic Circle, at a site now called Yana. Archaeologists uncovered stone and ivory tools dating back an astonishing 31,000 years. Among the earliest solid evidence of humans living this far north during the depths of the Ice Age. The tools include finely crafted foreshafts made from woolly rhinoceros horn and mammoth ivory, evidence of people not just surviving the Arctic cold, but doing so with real technical sophistication. It pushes back the known human presence in the far north by thousands of years earlier than previously assumed, suggesting people adapted to truly extreme environments far sooner than the story once allowed. Even in a stretch of frozen tundra that still challenges modern survival gear, people found a way to simply live and to live well. In the Yukon, a set of caves called Bluefish Caves have long sat at the center of a quiet but persistent archaeological argument After researchers proposed that cut marks on animal bones found their indicated human presence in far northwestern Canada more than 24,000 years ago, significantly earlier than most accepted timelines for human arrival in the Americas. Many archaeologists remain unconvinced, arguing the marks could have natural causes rather than deliberate butchery, and the debate continues without full resolution. Sites like this exist at the uncomfortable, exciting edge of what evidence can actually prove, neither confirmed nor dismissed, simply waiting for either better evidence or a more convincing counterargument. Not every mystery in archaeology gets to close cleanly. Some are left open on purpose, exactly as honest science requires. In central Texas, along a quiet, spring-fed creek, the Galt site has produced one of the largest collections of pre-Clovis artifacts found anywhere in North America, with tools dating back over 16,000 years, resting in soil layers well beneath the more famous Clovis material above them. The sheer volume of material recovered here, tens of thousands of individual stone artifacts, suggests not a brief passing visit, but a place returned to again and again across thousands of years, generation after generation, drawn back to the same reliable spring. It's a quiet reminder that long before Clovis technology existed, whole unnamed cultures were already living rich, continuous lives across this same familiar ground, leaving nothing behind but stone tools patiently worn by hands whose names we will simply never know. Across Ice Age Eurasia, one particular animal seems to have captured the imagination of ancient artists more than almost any other. The woolly rhinoceros, depicted repeatedly in cave paintings at sites like Chauvet, rendered with careful attention to its double horn and thick, shaggy coat. Frozen specimens recovered from Siberian permafrost have preserved not just bones, but skin, hair, and stomach contents, giving scientists an almost unnervingly complete picture of an animal none of us will ever see alive. They roamed across the cold, dry grasslands of the Ice Age in numbers substantial enough that ancient hunters clearly encountered them often, close enough to study the exact curve of a horn from memory. An entire species, once common enough to paint from familiarity, now survives only in frozen skin and the confident lines an artist once drew by torchlight. In the far north of Australia, a rock shelter called Mad Jed Bh Bay has pushed the story of human presence on that continent back further than almost anyone expected, with layers of ground ochre, stone tools, and grinding stones dated to at least 65,000 years ago. That places people in Australia not just before the Younger Dryas or Göbekli Tepe, but before humans had even reached most of Europe, arriving instead by boat across open water no one had ever crossed before. The site has produced the world's oldest known ground-edge stone axe, suggesting a level of tool-making sophistication far earlier than the gradual progress model of human technology once assumed. Somewhere in that layered dust lies proof that ingenuity didn't arrive on a single timetable everywhere at once. It simply arrived again and again, wherever people needed it most, near a dry lake bed in southeastern Australia called Lake Mungo. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man and woman, buried separately, but both treated with clear ceremony, dated to between 40 and 42,000 years ago. The woman, known respectfully today as Mungo Lady, had been cremated and her bones crushed before burial. One of the oldest known cremations found anywhere on Earth. Nearby, a set of fossilized human footprints preserved in ancient dried mud captures the running strides of a group of people, one apparently missing a leg below the knee, dashing across the claypan tens of thousands of years ago. For the Aboriginal peoples of this region, these are not distant strangers, but direct ancestors, part of an unbroken living culture stretching back further than any other on Earth. Across the vast red landscapes of Australia, the arrival of the first humans coincides closely with the disappearance of an entire caste of enormous native animals. Diprotodon, a wombat relative the size of a small car, giant flightless birds, and kangaroos standing over 6 feet tall, all vanishing within a relatively narrow window after human arrival. Whether hunting, the deliberate use of fire to reshape the landscape, or a shifting climate, bears the most responsibility remains genuinely debated among researchers, much like the parallel debate over North America's own vanished megafauna half a world away. What's clear is the pattern itself, repeating on different continents at different times. Wherever humans newly arrived, the largest animals around them tended not to last very long afterward. The same story, it seems, was quietly rehearsed again and again, continent after continent. In the caves of Eskol and Kafse, in what is now Israel, archaeologists uncovered tiny perforated seashells, deliberately pierced and likely once strung as beads, dating back roughly 100,000 years, among the oldest known personal ornaments made by human hands. The shells themselves came from species that lived along the Mediterranean coast, meaning they had to be carried, traded, or deliberately gathered from some distance away before reaching the cave where they were eventually buried alongside human remains. Long before clothing survives in any archaeological record, before pottery, before almost anything else we associate with culture, someone wanted to wear something simply because it was beautiful. The impulse to adorn ourselves, it turns out, may be nearly as old as being human at all. Around 74,000 years ago, a colossal volcanic eruption tore through what is now Sumatra. In an event known as the Toba supereruption, one of the largest volcanic events of the last 2 million years, ejecting enough ash to blanket vast stretches of South Asia in a layer several inches thick. Some scientists proposed decades ago that the resulting years of global cooling and reduced sunlight nearly wiped out the entire human species based on genetic evidence suggesting a dramatic population bottleneck around this same period. More recent archaeological findings, including continuous human activity in India, both before and after the ash layer, have cast real doubt on the most extreme version of this genetic bottleneck idea. Whatever truly happened in those difficult years, something in us clearly found a way through it. Thin as that thread of survival may have been for a long stretch of time, our own species shared the landscape of Ice Age Europe with the Neanderthals, a closely related human species with their own tools, their own fire, and increasingly evidence of their own capacity for symbolic thought. In a cave called Shanidar in northern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a Neanderthal burial surrounded by pollen from several kinds of flowers, leading early researchers to a romantic theory that Neanderthals had ceremonially covered their dead in blossoms. Later scientists suggested the pollen might have simply blown or been carried in by burrowing animals rather than deliberate human hands. And the debate over what it truly means continues today. Even the disagreement itself says something. We still, quietly, want to believe that whoever buried that body loved them enough to bring flowers. The last confirmed Neanderthals appear to have held on in a small, sea-facing cave called Goram's Cave on the Rock of Gibraltar, as recently as around 40,000 years ago, making this dramatic limestone cliff possibly the very last address, of an entire other kind of human being. Inside, archaeologists found a strange geometric pattern of deep lines deliberately carved into the cave floor's bedrock, resembling a hashtag or lattice shape made with clear intention rather than by accident. Whether it held meaning as art, a marker, or something closer to a message, we simply cannot translate. No one can say for certain. It is a strange thing to stand, even now, at what may have been the literal edge of an entire branch of humanity's world, quietly ending in a cave overlooking the sea. Today, most people of non-African descent carry a small but measurable percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their own genome, typically between 1 and 2%. The lingering genetic evidence of interbreeding that occurred when modern humans first expanded out of Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations already settled across Europe and Asia. Some of these inherited genes appear to have offered real, practical advantages, including certain immune system adaptations that may have helped early modern humans survive unfamiliar diseases in unfamiliar lands. Other inherited variants have been linked to modern conditions ranging from skin and hair traits to differences in pain sensitivity. It's a strange kind of afterlife for a vanished species, not preserved in monuments or myths, but quietly living on in the actual cells of billions of people who have never once thought to thank them for it. In a limestone cave in southern China, paleontologists uncovered a puzzling set of skeletal remains, nicknamed the Red Deer Cave people, for the extinct deer species found buried alongside them, showing an unusual mix of both modern and startlingly archaic physical features. Dated to as recently as around 14,000 years ago, remarkably late for such primitive-looking traits, the remains sparked real debate over whether they represented a distinct, unknown human lineage surviving far later than expected, or simply an unusual regional variation of early modern humans. More recent genetic analysis leans toward the latter, modern humans after all, but with an unusually archaic appearance. Even now, the full answer remains genuinely unsettled. One more quiet reminder that the edges of the human family tree are far blurrier than any tidy diagram ever suggests. Deep within a nearly inaccessible chamber of South Africa's rising star cave system, reachable only by squeezing through a passage barely 7 inches wide, researchers discovered the remains of a previously unknown human relative they named Homo naledi, alongside dozens of individuals deposited in the chamber. What makes the discovery so contentious is the researchers' proposal that these small-brained hominins deliberately carried their dead deep into this nearly unreachable darkness, an act suggesting intentional burial and possibly even symbolic thought, despite a brain roughly a third the size of our own. Many scientists remain cautious about this interpretation, noting how difficult it is to rule out natural explanations for how the bodies ended up so deep in the cave. It's a discovery that keeps quietly insisting we not be too certain about which qualities of being human belonged to us alone. Long before Göbekli Tepe, long before agriculture existed anywhere, some of humanity's earliest known pottery was already being fired by hunter-gatherers in Ice Age Japan, part of what archaeologists call the Johmon culture. Fragments recovered from sites there have been dated to over 16,000 years old, making them among the oldest ceramic vessels known anywhere on Earth, crafted by people who still relied entirely on hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. The pottery itself was often decorated with cord-marked patterns, pressed into the wet clay before firing, giving the culture its name, which translates roughly to cord-marked. It's a quiet correction to the old assumption that farming had to come first. Sometimes people simply wanted a better way to cook their fish long before they ever needed a pot to store their grain. At the ancient trading hub of Çatalhöyük and across the wider Neolithic Near East, archaeologists have traced obsidian tools back to their exact volcanic sources using geochemical fingerprinting, revealing trade networks stretching hundreds of miles across mountains, rivers, and unfamiliar territory. This sharp volcanic glass, prized for producing some of the finest cutting edges available before metal tools existed, moved from hand to hand along routes that most individual traders would never have walked from end to end themselves. It implies something remarkable about this deep, pre-literate past, organized cooperation and trust between communities who likely never met each other directly, relayed instead through countless small, patient exchanges. Long before any written contract existed, people had already worked out how to trust a stranger enough to trade with them. High in the Bolivian Andes, near the ancient city of Tiwanaku, a smaller complex called Piooma Punku features precisely cut stone blocks with strikingly clean angles and interlocking joints, crafted by a pre-Incan culture roughly 1,400 years ago. The remarkable precision of the stonework has attracted considerable speculation over the decades, including some fringe claims about advanced lost technology, though mainstream archaeologists attribute the craftsmanship to skilled stoneworking techniques, careful tool use, and an enormous, patient investment of human labor, rather than anything otherwise unexplained. The site sits at a much later date than Göbekli Tepe or the younger Dryas world we've spent most of tonight exploring. A reminder that human skill kept quietly astonishing us again and again across every single era rather than just the very first one. Off the coast of Turkey near the Bosphorus, and in scattered locations pulled from riverbeds and coastlines around the world, a 16th century map called the Piri Reis map has fascinated and puzzled historians since its rediscovery in 1929, showing coastlines that some have controversially claimed depict portions of Antarctica free of ice. The map itself, created by an Ottoman admiral, explicitly credits its sources to a patchwork of older charts, including ones reportedly used by Columbus, blending genuine exploration-era geography with considerable speculation and error in regions still unmapped at the time. Most historians and cartographers view the ice-free Antarctica interpretation as a significant stretch, a case of modern eyes seeing intention in what was likely a mix of guesswork, mythology, and honest cartographic mistakes. Even old maps, it seems, are just as capable of leading us astray as guiding us home. On the northern coast of Peru, along a river valley far from the more famous later civilizations of the Andes, sits the ancient city of Caral, built roughly 5,000 years ago, making it the oldest known urban center anywhere in the Americas. Remarkably, Caral shows no evidence of defensive walls, weapons stockpiles, or violent destruction, suggesting a society that grew large and complex without needing warfare to organize or sustain itself. Its people built pyramid-like platform mounds and sunken circular plazas, likely used for communal gatherings, without ever developing a written language that has survived to be deciphered. It stands as a quiet, patient counterexample to the old assumption that early complex societies were built primarily around conflict. Sometimes, it seems, people simply organize themselves around building something beautiful together instead. In South Africa's Wonderwork Cave, a place occupied on and off by early hominins for nearly 2 million years, archaeologists found something that pushed back one of humanity's most fundamental technologies far earlier than a unexpected burned plant ash and charred bone fragments deep inside the cave, dated to roughly 1 million years ago, among the earliest solid evidence of controlled fire use anywhere on Earth. Crucially, the burning occurred deep within the cave rather than near the entrance, making it unlikely the fire arrived by accident through a wildfire sweeping in from outside. It means the deliberate control of fire, one of the single most transformative tools our ancestors ever gained, arrived long before our own species even existed, inherited across hundreds of thousands of years by the many different kinds of humans who came after. Some inheritances, it seems, are older than humanity itself. On the shores of the Sea of Galilee, at a site called Ohalo Roman II, remarkably preserved by an unusual combination of waterlogging and low oxygen, archaeologists uncovered fragments of woven plant fibers dated to roughly 19,000 years old, among the oldest known examples of cordage, essentially early string or rope, ever found. The site also yielded brush hut remains, grinding stones, and an enormous variety of preserved seeds, offering an extraordinarily detailed snapshot of a hunter-gatherer camp, frozen in a single moment by pure geological luck. String may seem like an unglamorous invention next to fire or the wheel, but from it came fishing nets, clothing, snares, and eventually rope strong enough to move megalithic stone. Sometimes the quietest inventions turn out to be the ones that everything else secretly depends on. At Denisova Cave, the same remote Siberian site that gave us the first genetic evidence of an entirely new branch of humanity, archaeologists also recovered a small, carefully polished bone needle, complete with a drilled eye for thread, dated to roughly 50,000 years old. It represents one of the oldest known sewing needles anywhere on Earth, evidence that whoever crafted it wasn't simply draping themselves in loose hides, but fitting and stitching clothing with real precision, likely essential for surviving Siberian winters at all. A tool this small, this ordinary, rarely survives 50,000 years intact, and yet it did, quietly outlasting nearly everything else its maker ever touched. It's humbling to think that something as unremarkable as a sewing needle managed to survive as one of the last honest witnesses to an entire vanished way of life. In a peat bog in the Netherlands, workers in 1955 uncovered a long, hollowed-out log that turned out to be the oldest known boat in the world, a dugout canoe carved from a single Scots pine, trunk roughly 10,000 years ago. Known today as the Pest canoe, it predates the wheel by thousands of years. Evidence that people were already confidently navigating rivers and wetlands long before they had any comparable technology for traveling by land. Radiocarbon dating placed its construction right at the very edge of the Younger Dryas cold period, finally loosening its grip as rivers swelled with meltwater and the landscape reopened to travel. A single hollowed log, patiently preserved by cold, wet peat, ended up outlasting the entire civilization that carved it by 10,000 years. North of Dublin, in Ireland, a massive passage tomb called Newgrange was built more than 5,000 years ago, predating both England's Stonehenge and Egypt's Great Pyramid by several centuries. Its interior chamber engineered with remarkable precision. Once each year, on the morning of the winter solstice, a narrow beam of sunlight aligns perfectly through a specially built opening above the entrance, traveling down the 19-meter passage to illuminate the tomb's inner chamber for a matter of minutes. Whoever designed this had to understand, without telescopes or written mathematics, the precise angle of the rising midwinter sun, and build an entire earthen mountain of stone around that single, fleeting moment of light. Every year since, for 5,000 years, the sun has kept its half of that ancient appointment without fail, while most woolly mammoths vanished from the mainland roughly 10,000 years ago, alongside the rest of the Great Ice Age megafauna. A small, isolated population survived remarkably longer on Rangel Island, a remote stretch of land off the Siberian coast, cut off from the mainland as rising seas closed in around it. Genetic studies of their remains show these island mammoths persisted until roughly 4,000 years ago, meaning they were still alive, grazing quietly on a shrinking island, while the pyramids of Egypt were already standing, and Stonehenge's great stones were being raised in Britain. Isolation seems to have both saved them and slowly doomed them, their small, inbred population showing signs of genetic decline in their final centuries. It's a strange kind of vertigo, realizing an ice age giant and the pyramids briefly shared the same living world. On the Indonesian island of Borneo, in a cave called Liang Tibo, archaeologists uncovered the skeletal remains of a young adult missing the lower part of one leg. The bone ends smoothly healed rather than jagged, evidence the limb had been deliberately, surgically amputated rather than lost to accident or animal attack. Dated to around 31,000 years ago, it stands as the oldest known evidence of a successful surgical amputation anywhere in the world, performed with enough skill and enough follow-up care that the patient survived for years afterward. Someone in this ancient rainforest community understood infection risk, wound care, and recovery well enough to save a life through deliberate surgery. In an era we too often imagine as purely primitive, compassion and skill, it turns out, are far older companions than we tend to give them credit for. In the caves of the Swiss and Alpine regions, archaeologists in the early 20th century found something that sparked one of prehistory's more romantic and ultimately contested theories. Cave, bare skulls, and bones arranged in what appeared to be deliberate stone-lined niches, leading early researchers to propose a kind of prehistoric cave bear cult practiced by Neanderthals tens of thousands of years ago. Later, more careful analysis suggested many of these arrangements likely resulted from natural processes, bears simply dying in the same denning spots generation after generation, with rock falls and sediment doing the rest of the arranging. It remains a useful lesson in how easily an eager human mind can find ritual in what nature quietly assembled on its own, entirely without meaning to. Among the many creatures lost at the close of the Ice Age was the cave bear, a massive relative of modern bears that denned deep within the same cave systems humans and Neanderthals also occupied, leaving behind claw marks scratched high into cave walls and bones scattered by the thousands across cave floors throughout Europe. Standing larger than any bear alive today, they appear to have been primarily plant eaters. Despite their imposing size, their massive teeth better suited to grinding roots and vegetation than tearing flesh. Their extinction, occurring gradually as the Ice Age wound down, likely resulted from a combination of shrinking habitat, competition with humans for the same caves, and the same broader climate shifts reshaping the rest of the world. Even the animals that shared our exact shelters, it turns out, were not guaranteed to share our future. In the cave art scattered from Chauvet to Lascaux, one puzzle keeps quietly recurring: the near total absence of humans depicted with anything like the same skill and detail lavished on the animals around them. When human figures appear at all, they tend to be simplified, stick-like, sometimes strange composite creatures, part human and part animal, wildly different from the careful, lifelike shading given to horses, lions, and bison just beside them. No one fully knows why Ice Age artists, clearly capable of extraordinary realism, so rarely turned that same skill toward their own likeness. Perhaps humans weren't the point of the art at all. Perhaps, for whatever reason, this was never meant to be a mirror, but a window facing determinedly outward toward everything that wasn't them. In a limestone cave on Okinawa called Sakatari, archaeologists uncovered a pair of fish hooks carved from shell, dated to roughly 23,000 years ago, among the oldest fish hooks ever found anywhere on Earth. Crafting them would have required real patience and skill, carefully shaping brittle shell into a small curved barb strong enough to hold a struggling fish without snapping under the strain. Their presence suggests these ancient islanders had already developed a sophisticated, dedicated fishing culture, adapted specifically to a life surrounded by ocean rather than open plains full of grazing megafauna. It's easy to imagine grand mammoth hunts when picturing the Ice Age, and easy to forget that somewhere else entirely, a much quieter kind of survival was unfolding, patient, coastal, and shaped instead by tides. Across South America, an armored mammal called the glyptodon once roamed in numbers substantial enough to leave its rounded, tank-like fossilized shell scattered across the continent. Some individuals growing to the size of a small car, related distantly to modern armadillos despite their vastly greater size. Some researchers have proposed, based on cut marks found on certain shells, that early human hunters occasionally repurposed the massive, dome-shaped shells of already dead glyptodons as makeshift shelters, a strange and practical reuse of an animal too enormous to have been brought down easily by early hunting tools. Whether hunted directly or simply scavenged after death, glyptodons vanished along with the rest of South America's Ice Age giants roughly 10,000 years ago. It's a curious thought that the last shelter some ancient family ever built may have been another creature's own armor. In the deserts outside Las Vegas, a place called Gypsum Cave once sheltered an animal that seems almost impossible in hindsight. The Shasta ground sloth, a slow-moving giant that occasionally denned in dry caves across what is now the American Southwest, leaving behind not just bones, but astonishingly well-preserved dung, desiccated by the dry desert air rather than decomposed. Analysis of this ancient dung reveals exactly what these giant sloths were eating in their final years, offering a strangely intimate window into an animal that could stand taller than a grown man on its hind legs. Like so much of the Ice Age world, they disappeared as that world closed around 10,000 years ago, leaving their preserved droppings of all things as some of the clearest evidence they ever existed at all, long after most of the world's Ice Age megafauna had vanished. One enormous survivor lingered on in the forests and grasslands of Europe, far longer than almost anything else from that vanished world, the aurochs, a massive wild ancestor of modern cattle, standing taller at the shoulder than most people alive today. Julius Caesar himself wrote of hunting them in the forests of Gaul, describing an animal nearly the size of an elephant in ferocity, if not literal scale. The very last known aurochs, a female, died in a Polish forest in the year 1627, meaning this direct link to the Ice Age world we've spent all night exploring survived, not just past Stonehenge and the pyramids, but into an age of printed books and telescopes. Some threads connecting us to that ancient world, it turns out, stretched almost all the way to our own doorstep across the vast night sky of the Southern Hemisphere. Aboriginal Australian cultures identified a constellation unlike anything found in Western astronomy, not a pattern connecting individual stars, but a shape formed by the dark dust clouds of the Milky Way itself, describing the outline of a giant emu stretched across the galaxy. Oral traditions describing this emu in the sky and its seasonal changes have been passed down for many thousands of years, potentially among the oldest continuously observed astronomical traditions anywhere on Earth, tracking the emu's position to help predict when real emus would be laying eggs on the ground below. It's a gently humbling thought that while distant cultures were carving solstice-aligned stone circles, others were reading an entirely different kind of monument, built from darkness rather than stone, and just as precisely understood. In the mountains between South Africa and Swaziland, a small fragment of a baboon's fibula bone, marked with 29 deliberate notches, carved in a clear row, was found in a cave and dated to roughly 43,000 years ago. Known as the Lebombo bone, it stands as one of the oldest known mathematical artifacts on Earth, and its 29 notches have led some researchers to propose it may have functioned as a lunar counting tool. tracking the phases of the moon across a single cycle, whether it recorded moon phases, menstrual cycles, or simply tallied something else entirely lost to time. Its careful, evenly spaced marks reveal a mind already comfortable with abstraction, counting something that couldn't be held, only tracked. Long before numbers had names, it seems, someone had already found a reason to count. Carved from the wing bone of a griffin vulture, a small flute recovered from H.O.H. Fell's cave in Germany, the same site that yielded the ancient Venus figurine, has been dated to roughly 40,000 years old, making it among the oldest known musical instruments ever discovered. 5 carefully drilled finger holes run along its length, precise enough that researchers have been able to recreate its haunting, breathy tone on modern reproductions. Whoever carved it understood not just how to make a hole that produced sound, but how to space multiple holes to produce a deliberate range of different notes. It's worth sitting with for a moment that somewhere in the cold dark of an ice age winter, 40,000 years before recorded music existed, someone still wanted badly enough to carve it from bone, something beautiful to listen to across cave walls from France to Argentina to Indonesia. One particular kind of ancient art appears again and again with striking, almost eerie consistency. The hand stencil, made by pressing a hand flat against the rock and blowing pigment around it, leaving a ghostly negative outline behind. Found at Chauvet, at Argentina's Cueva de los Manos, and at caves across Borneo dated to nearly 40,000 years old, these stencils appear across cultures and continents that had no possible contact with one another, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years. And yet the impulse repeats, almost word for word in a language with no words at all. A hand pressed to stone, saying, in the oldest and simplest way anyone has ever found, I was here. At sites scattered across ancient farming communities in Neolithic France and beyond, archaeologists have found skulls bearing a startling surgical procedure known as trepanation. A hole deliberately cut or scraped into the living skull, the bone around its edges smoothly healed, meaning the patient survived the operation, sometimes for years afterward. Performed with nothing more than flint tools and presumably enormous courage on both sides, it may have been intended to relieve pressure from head injuries, treat seizures, or address ailments understood in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct. Remarkably, healed trepanned skulls have turned up on nearly every inhabited continent, evidence of a startlingly similar medical idea, arrived at again and again, independently, by people separated by oceans and thousands of years. Somewhere in that repetition is a very old, very human refusal to simply let suffering go untreated. If you've ever watched a pronghorn antelope run across the American plains, moving at speeds nearly rivaling an African cheetah, you've witnessed something biologists sometimes call an evolutionary ghost. No predator alive in North America today comes anywhere close to matching that speed, which seems, on the surface, like a strange and wasteful gift for evolution to hand an animal. The explanation lies with the American cheetah, a fast, cheetah-like predator that hunted these same plains until it vanished alongside the rest of the Ice Age megafauna roughly 12,000 years ago. The pronghorn's extraordinary speed is essentially a memory, carried forward in muscle and bone long after the predator that demanded it disappeared entirely. Some inheritances, it turns out, quietly outlive the very danger that first created them, long before Homo sapiens existed at all. An earlier human relative, called Homo erectus, appears to have accomplished something remarkable, reaching the isolated island of Flores in Indonesia, the very same island that would later produce the small hobbit species at some point around 1 million years ago. Because Flores was never connected to the mainland by any land bridge, even during the lowest sea levels of past ice ages, reaching it would have required crossing a significant stretch of open ocean, whether by accident on floating debris or through some deliberate, if primitive, use of rafts. If intentional, it would push back the origins of human seafaring by hundreds of thousands of years earlier than almost anyone previously assumed. Long before we had a word for the ocean, it seems, something in us was already willing to cross it. Exactly when wolves first became dogs remains one of the more stubbornly unresolved questions in archaeology, with genetic and fossil evidence offering estimates ranging anywhere from 15,000 to over 40,000 years ago, and researchers still disagreeing over where and how many separate times it may have happened. Unlike the deliberate domestication of crops or livestock, dogs may represent something closer to a mutual, gradual drift, wolves less fearful of human camps, venturing closer for scraps, generation after generation, until the friendliest among them became something closer to companions than competitors. It may be the case that dogs domesticated themselves nearly as much as we domesticated them. An ancient, patient negotiation carried out gradually around countless dying campfires. Whatever the true timeline turns out to be, we have clearly never once regretted, however it happened, letting them in. Soaring over the Ice Age landscapes of North America was Territornis, an enormous bird of prey with a wingspan stretching up to 12 feet, large enough to comfortably scavenge from the carcasses of mammoths and giant ground sloths alongside dire wolves and saber-toothed cats. Its remains have been recovered in substantial numbers from the La Brea tar pits, drawn in, like so many other predators and scavengers, by the promise of an easy meal that instead became its own final resting place. When the great Ice Age herbivores disappeared, so too did the abundant carrion that had sustained such an enormous flying scavenger, and Territornis vanished not long after. Its closest surviving relative today, the California condor, still glides over some of the very same California hills, a smaller, quieter echo of a much larger world. After a night spent moving between comets and cave paintings, sunken lands and sewing needles, it's worth sitting for a moment with just how much of this enormous story is still being actively written, not by us tonight, but by researchers with trowels and dating equipment right now in the present. Every single year brings new radiocarbon dates, new genetic sequences, new sites pulled carefully from beneath the soil, each one capable of quietly rearranging a timeline that felt settled only a decade earlier. Göbekli Tepe itself waited 11,000 patient years under its own deliberately placed rubble before a shepherd's plow ever gave it away. There is a genuine comfort in that thought, that the past isn't finished being discovered, and that somewhere out there, more of it is still patiently waiting, exactly where it's always been, for someone to finally come looking. In a cave in the Republic of Georgia called Zuzwana, researchers examining ancient sediment layers found something unexpected under the microscope: tiny fibers of wild flax. Some dyed in shades of turquoise, pink, and black, dated to roughly 34,000 years old, among the oldest known evidence of textile production anywhere on Earth. Long before woven cloth, before farming, before pottery, someone was already twisting plant fiber into thread and experimenting deliberately with color. It suggests a level of craft and aesthetic ambition tucked quietly into an era we too often imagine only in terms of bare survival. Whoever chose to dye that flax turquoise wasn't simply staying warm, they were, in some small and very human way, still choosing beauty on purpose. In Armenia's Arani one cave, tucked beside the remains of an ancient winery containing the world's oldest known winemaking equipment, archaeologists uncovered something else remarkably well preserved by the cave's cool, dry conditions. A single leather shoe, stuffed with grass, likely for warmth or shape retention, dated to roughly 5,500 years old. Made from a single piece of cowhide laced together with a leather cord, it remains the oldest known leather shoe ever found intact, its size suggesting it belonged to someone with fairly small feet, possibly a woman. There is something startlingly intimate about a shoe surviving this long, an object shaped so precisely around one particular person's foot, waiting patiently in the dark for over 5,000 years to be found again on the coast of northern England at a site called Starcar. Archaeologists uncovered something unusual among the more familiar flint tools and animal bones. More than 20 deer skull headdresses, each carved from a red deer skull with the antlers still attached, holes bored through for straps, dated to roughly 11,000 years ago, where patterns on the antlers suggest they weren't purely ceremonial display pieces left untouched, but were actually worn repeatedly, likely during hunting rituals, or perhaps symbolic performances meant to connect the wearer with the animal itself. It's a striking image to sit with hunters at the very edge of the retreating ice age, deliberately becoming, if only for the length of a ceremony, the very creature whose survival their own lives depended on. On the wind-battered coast of Scotland's Orkney Islands, a fierce storm in 1,850 tore away enough sand dune to reveal something extraordinary buried beneath it. An entire Neolithic village called Skarabree. Its stone houses, so well preserved by centuries of protective sand, that even interior stone furniture, dressers, beds, and hearths still stood essentially intact. Built and occupied roughly 5,000 years ago, its structures predate both Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid of Giza, evidence of a settled, comfortable domestic life thriving on a remote northern island most people today would consider inhospitable. A storm meant to erode the coastline instead delivered, with strange generosity, an entire ancient home back into the light, furniture and all. In a burial near the German town of Bad Durenberg, archaeologists uncovered the grave of a woman buried roughly 9,000 years ago, surrounded by an extraordinary collection of objects: turtle shells, animal bones, antlers, and flint blades, arranged with clear ceremonial care. Researchers studying the grave have proposed she may have held the role of a shaman within her community, a spiritual specialist entrusted with healing, ritual, and mediating between the visible world and whatever lay beyond it. Buried alongside her was an infant, and evidence suggests the two may have died at nearly the same time, their fates bound together in death, as she may have been bound in life to caring for others. Whatever her exact role, someone thought her important enough to send into the ground, surrounded by nearly everything she owned. Among the animals that somehow rode out the extinctions closing the Ice Age, largely unchanged, is the Saiga antelope, a strange, big-nosed grazer that once roamed alongside woolly mammoths and lived through the exact Younger Dryas cooling that ended so much else around it. Its oddly oversized, drooping nose, once puzzling to naturalists, turns out to be a remarkably effective built-in filter, warming and cleaning frigid, dust-laden Ice Age air before it ever reached the animal's lungs. While mammoths, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats all disappeared, the Saiga simply kept grazing, largely unbothered, across the cold Eurasian steppe, essentially unchanged in appearance for tens of thousands of years. Not every Ice Age story ends in disappearance. Some, quietly and stubbornly, are still out there grazing, exactly as they always have. Among the most fearsome predators of Ice Age North America was the short-faced bear, Arctodus, standing taller on all fours than a modern grizzly stands on its hind legs, with proportionally longer legs suggesting it may have been built for speed rather than the slow, lumbering gait we associate with bears today. Some researchers have proposed it was less a dedicated hunter than an enormous, intimidating scavenger, powerful and fast enough to simply chase smaller predators off their own kills rather than bring down prey itself. Its remains, found from Alaska down into Mexico, suggest a wide-ranging, adaptable animal that thrived right up until the same broad wave of extinctions swept away nearly everything else its size. It's an odd comfort, somehow, that even the most fearsome animal in a landscape isn't guaranteed anything by its size alone. In the permafrost of northeastern Siberia, researchers in 2020 uncovered something almost unbelievable: the mummified body of a scimitar-toothed cat cub, complete with fur, whiskers, and soft tissue, frozen and preserved for an estimated 35,000 years. Known as Homo therium, this extinct predator had roamed across Ice Age Eurasia and the Americas alike. But until this discovery, scientists had only ever known it through bones and teeth. Seeing its actual face for the first time, round-eared and soft-furred, strikingly different from what fossil skulls alone had suggested, offered researchers an entirely new understanding of what this animal truly looked like in life. Sometimes the past doesn't just leave clues behind. Every so often, almost impossibly, it leaves us something close to a photograph. Long before Spanish conquistadors ever brought horses back across the Atlantic in the 16th century, horses had already been thriving in North America for millions of years, having actually evolved there in the first place before spreading to Asia and Europe across the ancient Bering Land Bridge. Then, around the same narrow window that claimed mammoths and saber-toothed cats, native North American horses vanished from the continent entirely, disappearing from the very land where the species had first evolved. When Spanish horses finally returned centuries later, they weren't introducing something truly foreign at all. They were simply bringing an old resident home after an absence of roughly 10,000 years. Sometimes an ending and a homecoming turn out to be the very same story, just separated by an unimaginably long pause. Alongside horses, another now unfamiliar animal once called Ice Age North America home, Camelops, a Native American camel standing taller than its modern desert relatives, roaming grasslands from Alaska down into Mexico for millions of years before vanishing in that same closing chapter of the Ice Age. Camels, like horses, actually originated in North America before spreading elsewhere across the ancient land bridges, meaning both animals we now think of as distinctly foreign desert camels and wild mustangs alike trace their deepest roots back to this same vanished continent. It's a small, quiet correction worth sitting with. So much of what we assume belongs somewhere else in the world may simply be an old native, once lost, eventually finding its way, however roundabout, back home. Distinct from the more famous woolly mammoth, another massive Ice Age relative called the American mastodon roamed the forests and wetlands of North America, a browser that fed on leaves, twigs, and shrubs, rather than the open grasslands mammoths preferred. At a bog in Washington state known as the Manny Site, archaeologists found a mastodon rib bone with a fragment of a bone spear point still lodged directly inside it. The wound partially healed, meaning the animal survived the initial attack before eventually dying some time later, dated to nearly 14,000 years ago. It stands as some of the most direct physical evidence anywhere of ancient humans actively hunting these Ice Age giants, an embedded weapon telling a very old story of a hunt that, at least for a while, the mastodon actually managed to survive. For nearly all of the long story we've wandered through tonight, the entire human population of the planet, spread across every continent except Antarctica, likely numbered only in the low millions, smaller than a single modern city today. Every cave painting, every carefully carved pillar, every quietly buried temple was created by a species that was, by any modern measure, remarkably rare, and scattered across an enormous, largely empty world. It makes the sheer scale of what survives feel even more improbable. That so few people, spread so thin across so much wilderness, still managed to leave behind flutes and shoes and temples, and flooded mammoth bone houses for us to eventually find. A small, scattered species, it turns out, can still leave an enormous, patient mark on the world it moves through. Just as suddenly as the Younger Dryas began, it ended, the world's temperatures snapping back toward warmth in what ice core records suggest may have taken as little as a single human decade, an almost unbelievably fast recovery by any geological measure. Glaciers that had spent over 1,000 years reclaiming lost ground began retreating again almost immediately. Rivers swelled, and the slow work of a warming world resumed, as though the cold interruption had simply been a brief, sharp intake of breath. Whatever caused that abrupt plunge into cold, whether comet, meltwater flood, or some combination we haven't fully identified, its ending remains just as mysterious as its beginning. The world, it seems, can change its mind quickly in either direction, and rarely bothers to explain itself either way. Looking across the whole span of what we've wandered through tonight, one pattern keeps quietly resurfacing no matter which continent it appears on again and again. Whenever humans newly arrived somewhere, whether North America, Australia, or the scattered islands between, the largest animals living there tended not to last very long afterward. It happened with mammoths and ground sloths in the Americas, with Diprotodon and giant kangaroos in Australia. A pattern so consistent across such vastly different times and places that it can't easily be dismissed as coincidence. Climate shifts certainly played their part in every single case, tangled together with hunting pressure in ways scientists still work to untangle. Wherever people finally arrived, it seems, the world they found rarely stayed quite the same for very long afterward. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, along the shores of a lake, a small bone tool known as the Ishango bone was recovered, bearing groups of notches arranged in distinct, deliberate clusters, dated to somewhere between 18 and 20,000 years old. Unlike simpler tally marks, its notches are grouped in ways that some mathematicians have proposed reflect an early understanding of multiplication, or possibly even a rudimentary lunar calendar tracking the phases of the moon across several months. Other researchers remain more cautious, noting how easily we can project sophisticated meaning onto patterns that may have served a simpler purpose entirely. Either way, it stands as a quiet monument to a mind already comfortable organizing the world into groups, categories, and patterns, long before anyone had a word for mathematics at all. Across Australia for tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal communities practiced a deliberate, carefully timed form of controlled burning, now often called fire stick farming, setting small, low-intensity fires through the landscape in a rotating patchwork to encourage new plant growth, flush out game, and prevent the kind of catastrophic, uncontrolled wildfires that untended land eventually accumulates fuel for. This wasn't destruction, but a form of long-term, generational gardening, applied at the scale of an entire continent, shaping the very ecosystems early European settlers later mistook for pure, untouched wilderness. It represents one of the longest continuously practiced land management traditions on Earth, refined generation after generation across a time span that dwarfs almost any other human institution still recognizable today. Sometimes the deepest kind of care looks, to an outside eye, exactly like doing nothing at all. Across the Australian outback, Aboriginal cultures developed what are known as songlines, oral pathways of story and song that trace specific routes across the landscape, encoding directions, water sources, and landmarks within the rhythm and sequence of the words themselves. A person who knew the correct song could, in principle, navigate hundreds of miles of unfamiliar desert simply by singing the journey in the proper order, each verse marking the next feature to look for on the horizon. Some songlines are believed to preserve knowledge stretching back many thousands of years, potentially including memories of coastlines that have since been swallowed by rising post-ice age seas. It is, in its own way, one of the most elegant technologies ever devised, an entire map, precise enough to survive a desert crossing, small enough to carry in nothing but memory and breath. And so we come, gently, to the end of tonight's long walk backward through time. We've moved through a world of comets and cold snaps, of temples buried on purpose and cities swallowed by rising seas, of mammoth bone houses and bone flutes, and a single small footprint pressed into mud 21,000 years ago. We followed a shepherd's plow into a hillside that turned out to hold the oldest temple ever found, and followed a storm's wind off a Scottish coastline into a village no one alive had known was there. Rivers we've never seen swallowed whole coastlines. Ice we will never touch still remembers, in faint chemical traces, a sky that may once have torn itself open above a vanished world of hunters. We've met people who nursed sick puppies back to health, who dyed their thread turquoise for no practical reason at all, who buried their dead with flowers or shells, or 100 carefully made tools, simply because they loved them. None of it was tidy. None of it arrived in a straight line. And that, in its own way, is the whole point. The deep past was never a single story marching toward us. It was thousands of small, scattered human choices made in the dark, most of them never meant to be remembered by anyone at all, let alone by us. All these thousands of years later, what ties every single one of these fragments together isn't really the dates, or the artifacts, or even the mysteries still left unsolved. It's something quieter than that, an old, patient thread of curiosity, of care, of people, simply wanting to build something, remember someone, or understand a little more of the sky above them, long before anyone was keeping score. That thread runs, unbroken, all the way from a carved stone pillar 11,000 years ago to whatever quiet corner of the world you're resting in right now. If your mind is still drifting somewhere back there among the ice and the stone, that's all right. There's nothing left to hold onto tonight, nothing to remember for later. Just let it all go soft and blur together the way the edges of a dream do. Let your jaw unclench one more time. Let your shoulders sink a little further into whatever is holding you. Take one more slow breath in and let it go even more slowly than the last one. If you're still awake and still wanting more, there's another video like this one waiting whenever you need it. Another long, quiet walk through the past, ready to carry you the rest of the way to sleep. But for now, there's nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do. The stones will still be there tomorrow. The mammoths will still be frozen in the ice. The whole patient, ancient world will keep exactly where it is, waiting the way it always has. There is no rush to any of this, and there never really was, not for the people who buried their temple, not for the sea that took 10,000 years to finish rising, and not for you right now, letting go of this last small stretch of the day. Rest easy. Let it all fall away. Sleep well. I'll see you next time.